Hello everyone, I am the Seleni, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The drill bit screamed through the ancient rock, its diamond teeth biting into stone that had remained undisturbed for 40,000 years. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow as the sun hammered down on the remote Western Australian mining site, the temperature already climbing past 40 degrees Celsius despite the early hour. The red earth stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional ghost gum and the sprawling infrastructure of the Kalgoorlie Extended Mining Consortium's newest operation. Something was wrong with the drill. Jake had been operating heavy machinery for 15 years, first in the coal mines of Queensland, then in the iron ore pits of the Pilbara, and now here in the goldfields. He knew the sound of metal cutting through rock, the rhythm of progress, the subtle vibrations that told him everything was working as it should. But this morning, the drill was fighting him, bucking and shuddering like a wild animal trying to break free. Bloody hell, he muttered, throttling back the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the camp's generators and the ever-present buzz of flies. Jake climbed down from the cab, his boots hitting the red dust with a soft thud. The drill had penetrated nearly 40 meters into the rock face, deeper than any of the previous test holes. They were looking for a new gold seam, something that might extend the life of the mine by another decade. As he approached the drill site, Jake noticed something that made his stomach clench. The rock around the hole was different, not the familiar iron-stained sandstone and granite they'd been drilling through for weeks, but something older, darker. The stone had an almost organic quality to it, as if it had been shaped by something other than geological forces. Strange patterns spiraled outward from the drill hole, resembling the Aboriginal rock art he'd seen in other parts of the territory. But these markings seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision. Jake pulled out his phone to call the site supervisor, but the screen showed no signal. That was odd. They usually had at least one bar out here, enough to make calls back to Perth. He walked a few meters away from the drill site, holding the phone above his head, but the signal remained dead. The silence was becoming oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath. That's when he heard it, a sound like distant thunder, but coming from below, from the depths of the earth itself. The ground beneath his feet began to vibrate, subtly, at first, then with increasing intensity. Jake had experienced minor earthquakes before, but this was different. The vibration had a rhythm to it, almost like a heartbeat, growing stronger and more insistent with each pulse. The drill hole began to emit a sound, a low harmonic note that seemed to resonate in his bones. Jake approached cautiously, his mining instincts screaming at him to retreat, to get back to the camp and report what he'd found. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, drew him forward. He knelt beside the hole and peered into its depths. The drill bit was gone. 40 meters of hardened steel simply vanished into the earth. But more disturbing was what he could see in the dim light filtering down the shaft. The walls of the hole were not rough-hewn rock as they should have been, but smooth, almost polished, covered in the same spiraling patterns he'd noticed on the surface. And deep in the darkness below, something gleamed with a faint, phosphorescent light. Jake's radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Morrison, you copy? We've got some kind of seismic event showing up on the monitors back at base. Everything okay out there?" He fumbled for the radio, his hands shaking. Yeah, Dave. I'm here. The drills hit something strange. I think we need to... The radio went dead. Not just silent, but completely dead. As if the electronics had been fried by some invisible force. Jake stood up, his legs unsteady, and looked around the mining site. The familiar landscape of red earth and blue sky suddenly seemed alien, threatening. The shadows cast by the ghost gums appeared to be moving, reaching toward him with gnarled fingers. He turned to run back to his truck, but froze. The vehicle was no longer where he'd left it. In fact, there was no sign of the access road, the camp, or any of the mining infrastructure. Jake found himself standing alone in an endless expanse of red earth, with only the drill hole marking the spot where civilization had once existed. The sound from below was growing louder, more complex. It was no longer just a rhythmic pulsing, but something that almost resembled music, if music could be played on instruments made of stone and bone, in harmonies that human ears were never meant to hear. Jake stumbled backward, his mind struggling to process what was happening. The logical part of his brain, the part trained in engineering and physics, insisted that this was impossible. But the older part, the part that remembered campfire stories and childhood fears, recognized the sound for what it was. Something ancient and hungry, stirring after eons of sleep. The earth around the drill hole began to crack, and from the fissures seeped a thick, dark liquid that looked almost like blood, but moved with its own purpose, flowing upward against gravity. Where it touched the red earth, the soil began to change, becoming richer, more fertile, but also somehow wrong. Plants began to grow with impossible speed, but they were not the hardy desert flora Jake knew. These were older plants, ferns, and cicads and strange flowering things that belonged to a world long dead. Jake ran. He ran without direction, without purpose, driven only by the primal need to escape. Behind him, the sound from the drill hole grew to a roar, and the earth itself seemed to be screaming. He could feel the vibrations through his feet, up his legs, into his very bones. The ancient music was calling to him, trying to pull him back, but he fought against it with every fiber of his being. As he ran, Jake began to see things that couldn't be there. Figures in the distance, tall and impossibly thin, moving with a grace that no human could achieve. They seemed to be made of shadow and red earth, and their eyes, if they had eyes, glowed with the same phosphorescent light he'd seen in the ice drill hole. They were watching him, following him, but always keeping their distance, as if they were herding him toward some predetermined destination. The sun, which had been beating down mercilessly all morning, began to dim. Not with the gradual approach of clouds, but suddenly, as if someone had placed a filter over the sky. The light took on a reddish quality, and Jake realized with growing horror that the very air was changing color, becoming thick and viscous, like blood. He stumbled and fell, his hands scraping against the rough earth. When he looked up, he saw that he was no longer alone. The shadow figures had surrounded him, and now he could see them clearly. They were not made of earth and shadow as he'd thought, but of something far more disturbing. They were human, or had been once, but changed by whatever was emerging from the drill hole. Their skin was red and cracked like dried earth, and from the cracks seeped the same dark liquid he'd seen at the drill site. Their eyes were pools of that phosphorescent light. And when they opened their mouths to speak, their voices were the sound of wind through stone. "You have awakened the dreaming," they said in unison, their words echoing strangely in the thick air. The old ones stir. The red earth remembers. Jake tried to speak, to ask what they meant, but found that his voice was gone. The red air was too thick to breathe, too viscous to allow sound. He could only listen as the figures continued their pronouncement. For 40,000 years, they have slept beneath the sacred places, waiting for the time of return. The white man's metal has broken the seals, and now the awakening begins. What was taken will be reclaimed. What was lost will be found. The red earth rises. The figures began to move closer, and Jake could see that they were not walking but flowing, like liquid given form. Their touch, when it came, was not painful, but strangely comforting, like sinking into warm mud. He felt his own body beginning to change, his skin taking on the same red, cracked appearance as theirs. The transformation was oddly peaceful, as if he was finally becoming what he was always meant to be. As Jake's humanity slipped away, his consciousness expanded. He could see across the entire continent, from the red heart of the outback to the blue waters of the Pacific. He could see other drill sites, other mining operations, other places where the white man's technology had pierced the Earth's protective crust. And at each of these sites, the same awakening was beginning. In the Pilbara, a massive iron ore mine had struck something that wasn't iron ore. The miners had fled when the pit began to sing, a deep harmonious note that shattered windows and drove dogs mad. The ore they'd been pulling from the earth for decades was changing, becoming something organic, something alive. The massive trucks and earth-moving equipment had been abandoned, but they were not empty. Things moved in their cabs, things that had once been human, but were now something else, something that belonged to the red earth. In Queensland, a coal mine had broken through into a vast underground cavern that contained no coal, but something far older. The miners who had descended into the depths had not returned, but their voices could still be heard echoing up from the tunnels, singing songs in a language that predated human speech. The coal seam itself was changing, becoming a rich, dark soil from which impossible gardens grew in the absolute darkness below ground. In South Australia, a copper mine had uncovered a series of interconnected chambers filled with the same phosphorescent light. The miners had described walls covered in Aboriginal rock art, but art that moved and changed when viewed directly. The copper ore had begun to take on organic properties, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the human heartbeat. Workers who spent too long in the tunnels began to exhibit strange symptoms. Their skin took on a metallic sheen, and they spoke of hearing voices in the ore itself. In Northern Territory, a uranium mine had encountered radiation levels that were impossible according to all known science. The uranium ore was not radioactive in the conventional sense, but emitted a different kind of energy, something that affected the mind rather than the body. The Aboriginal communities in the area had fled, speaking of the rainbow serpent awakening, of the old stories coming true. The mining equipment had been abandoned, but it continued to operate on its own, driven by something that was not electricity. And now, as Jake's transformed consciousness spread across the continent, he could see the connections between all these sites. They formed a vast pattern, a network of power that had been laid down in the dream time, when the world was young and the spirits walked the earth. The mining operations had unknowingly traced this ancient network, their drill holes and excavations, following the same paths that the ancestral spirits had traveled when they shaped the land. The awakening was not random. It was coordinated, purposeful. Something vast and ancient was using the mining infrastructure as a means to return to the surface world. The red earth was not just soil and rock, but a living entity, a consciousness that had been sleeping for millennia, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what had been taken from it. Jake's awareness expanded further. and he could see the cities: Perth, Adelaide, Darwin, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne. They appeared as ugly scars on the living landscape, concrete and steel and glass, imposed upon the natural order. But even in these urban centers, the awakening was beginning. The red earth was seeping up through the foundations, through the sewer systems, through the subway tunnels. It was patient, inexorable, transforming everything it touched. In Perth, the first signs appeared in the underground parking garages. Security guards working the night shift reported seeing red stains on the concrete walls, stains that moved and spread when no one was looking. The stains formed patterns, spirals, and dots that resembled Aboriginal rock art, but seemed to convey a message that was both ancient and urgently contemporary. Those who stared at the patterns too long began to experience vivid dreams of red earth and singing stones, dreams that continued even when they were awake. The Perth Water Corporation received its first complaint about the taste of the tap water on a Tuesday morning in March. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchinson, a retired teacher from Subiaco, called to report that her water had developed a metallic taste overnight and had taken on a reddish tint. The customer service representative assured her that the issue would be investigated, but by the end of the week, similar complaints were pouring in from across the metropolitan area. The water treatment plants were baffled. Their tests showed that the water was clean, that there were no contaminants, no bacteria, no heavy metals. Yet the water continued to change, becoming redder and more metallic with each passing day. Workers at the treatment facilities began to report strange symptoms: headaches, vivid dreams, and a compulsive need to touch the earth with their bare hands. Dr. Sarah Chen, a hydrogeologist with the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, was assigned to investigate the anomaly. She had worked in Western Australia for 15 years, studying the complex underground water systems that sustained the state's mining industry and urban centers. She had never encountered anything like the reports coming in from across Perth. Sarah's first stop was the Mundering Weir, one of the primary sources of Perth's water supply. The massive concrete structure, built in the early 1900s, had served the city faithfully for over a century. But as Sarah approached the reservoir, she could see that something was wrong. The water, which should have been clear and blue, had taken on a distinctly reddish hue. It was not the muddy red of sediment or algae, but something deeper, more saturated, like the color of blood. She took water samples from various points around the reservoir, noting that the red coloration was strongest near the dam wall itself. The concrete structure, which had been pristine white for decades, was now stained with the same red color. The staining followed a pattern, spiraling outward from the base of the dam in a design that Sarah recognized as similar to Aboriginal rock art she'd seen in other parts of the state. As Sarah worked, she became aware of a sound, so low and subtle that she almost missed it. It seemed to be coming from the water itself, a harmonic vibration that resonated in her bones. She found herself humming along unconsciously, and when she realized what she was doing, she stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was oppressive, as if the water was waiting for her to continue the song. Her water samples, when analyzed at the laboratory, showed impossible results. The water contained elements that shouldn't exist, isotopes that were unknown to science, organic compounds that had no earthly origin. Yet the water was not radioactive, not toxic, not harmful in any measurable way. If anything, it seemed to be more pure than before, as if it had been filtered through some process that removed not just impurities, but the very essence of what made it ordinary water. Sarah's investigation led her to other water sources around Perth, and she found the same phenomenon everywhere. The Swan River, which flowed through the heart of the city, was changing color from its source in the hills to its mouth at the Indian Ocean. The underground aquifers that supplied the city's bore water were showing the same red tinge and the same impossible purity. But it was not just the water that was changing. The earth itself was transforming. In Kings Park, the largest inner-city park in the world, the native vegetation was growing with unprecedented vigor. Plants that had struggled in the thin, sandy soil were now thriving, their roots reaching deep into the earth, and their leaves taking on a reddish tinge that matched the water. The park's botanists were baffled. Some of the plants were exhibiting characteristics that they'd never seen before, as if they were evolving in real time. The changes were subtle at first, but they accelerated with each passing day. The red earth was not just seeping into the water supply and the vegetation, it was affecting the people as well. Residents across Perth began to report strange dreams, vivid and intense, filled with images of red earth and singing stones. The dreams were so realistic that many people woke up with red dust on their hands and feet, even though they had been sleeping indoors. Dr. Marcus Webb, a neurologist at Royal Perth Hospital, was among the first to notice the pattern. Patients were presenting with symptoms that resembled temporal lobe epilepsy, vivid hallucinations, altered consciousness, and a compulsive need to touch the earth. But their brain scans were normal, and the symptoms didn't respond to conventional treatments. The only common factor was that all of the patients had consumed Perth's water supply in the weeks leading up to their symptoms. Marcus had grown up in Perth, the son of a mining engineer who had worked in the goldfields. He had heard the Aboriginal stories about the dream time, about the spirits that lived in the land, but he had always dismissed them as folklore. Now, as he examined patient after patient with the same impossible symptoms, he began to wonder if there was more truth to the old stories than he had ever imagined. The breakthrough came when Marcus decided to test the water himself. He took a sample of the red water from the hospital's supply and analyzed it under a microscope. What he saw defied everything he knew about biology and physics. The water contained structures that resembled neural networks, complex patterns of organic matter that pulsed with their own rhythm. It was as if the water itself was alive, thinking, communicating. Marcus's research was interrupted by a call from his colleague, Dr. Jennifer Hayes, who worked at the Children's Hospital. "Marcus, you need to see this. We've had 12 children admitted in the past 24 hours, all with the same symptoms. They're not sick exactly. They're changed. They're speaking in languages that don't exist, drawing pictures of things they've never seen. And Marcus, they all taste like red earth." When Marcus arrived at the Children's Hospital, he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The affected children were sitting in a circle in the hospital's play area, their hands pressed against the floor, their eyes closed in concentration. They were humming in unison, a low harmonic note that seemed to resonate through the building itself. The floor beneath their hands was changing, the sterile linoleum taking on a reddish tinge and beginning to crack in spiraling patterns. 8-year-old Tommy Phillips looked up at Marcus with eyes that were no longer entirely human. "The old ones are coming back, Doctor. The earth is singing again. Can you hear it?" Marcus could hear it. The harmonic note was getting stronger, more complex, and he realized that it was not coming from the children, but from the earth itself, from the very foundations of the building. The red earth was rising, seeping up through the concrete and steel, reclaiming what had been taken from it. Across Perth, similar scenes were playing out. In office buildings, workers found themselves drawn to the ground floor, their hands pressed against the concrete walls, listening to the song of the earth. In suburban homes, families gathered in their backyards, digging in the soil with their bare hands, searching for something they couldn't name but knew they had to find. The city's infrastructure began to fail, but not in the way that engineers expected. The failures were purposeful, coordinated, as if the city itself was being dismantled from within. Power grids shut down in patterns that resembled Aboriginal art. Water mains burst in sequences that followed the underground river systems that had existed before the city was built. And roads cracked along the paths that had once been songlines, the sacred tracks that crisscrossed the continent. The government tried to respond, but their efforts were hampered by the fact that their own personnel were being affected by the phenomenon. Military commanders found themselves unable to give orders to attack the Red Earth, as if some deeper part of their consciousness recognized it as sacred. Politicians who tried to speak about the crisis found themselves unconsciously humming the Earth's song, their words becoming part of the ancient harmony. In the eastern states, the news from Western Australia was initially dismissed as mass hysteria or some kind of chemical contamination. But as similar reports began to emerge from mining areas across the continent, the scope of the phenomenon became impossible to ignore. In Sydney, the first signs appeared in the harbour itself. Ferry passengers reported seeing red stains in the water, spreading outward from the base of the harbour bridge. The stains formed patterns that resembled the Aboriginal rock art found in the sandstone caves around the harbour. But these patterns seemed to move and change with the tides. Dr. Rachel Morrison, a marine biologist with the Sydney Institute of Marine Science, was called in to investigate. Rachel had spent her career studying the harbour's ecosystem, from the eye, microscopic plankton to the massive whale migrations that brought tourists from around the world. She had never seen anything like the phenomenon that was now transforming the harbour. The red substance in the water was not algae or bacteria, but something that defied classification. Under the microscope, it appeared to be a complex network of organic structures, similar to neural tissue but far more intricate than anything found in known biology. It seemed to be capable of communication, responding to stimuli in coordinated patterns that suggested intelligence. Rachel's research was complicated by the fact that the red substance seemed to be aware of her observations. When she took samples, the patterns would shift and change, as if they were trying to communicate with her. She found herself spending hours staring into the microscope, trying to decode the messages that the substance seemed to be sending. The breakthrough came when Rachel realized that the patterns matched the Aboriginal rock art found in the caves around the harbour. She had studied these caves as part of her research into the harbour's pre-European ecosystem, and she recognized the spirals and dot patterns that were now appearing in the water. The Aboriginal elders she had consulted during her research had told her that the rock art was a form of communication, a way of recording the stories and laws of the Dreamtime. Rachel contacted Uncle Billy Patterson, an Aboriginal elder who had been one of her primary consultants. Uncle Billy was a traditional owner of the land around Sydney Harbour, and he had been instrumental in helping Rachel understand the cultural significance of the marine environment. When she described what she was seeing in the water, his response was immediate and alarming. "The rainbow serpent is waking up, Rachel. The old stories are coming true. The land is calling back to its original owners, and it's not just the Aboriginal people. It's the spirits themselves, the ones who made the land in the first place." Uncle Billy explained that the rock art around the harbour was not just decoration or historical record, but a form of spiritual technology. The patterns contained power, and when they were activated, they could communicate across vast distances and through time itself. The red substance in the water was not an invasion, but a homecoming. The return of the ancestral spirits to the places they had created in the dream time. As Uncle Billy spoke, Rachel began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The mining operations across the continent had not just disturbed the earth. They had broken the seals that had kept the ancestral spirits in their dormant state. The spirits were now awakening, and they were reclaiming the land that had been taken from them. The transformation of Sydney Harbor accelerated over the following weeks. The red substance spread from the harbor to the city's water supply, and from there to every corner of the metropolitan area. The Sydney Opera House, that iconic symbol of modern Australia, began to change. The white concrete sails took on a reddish tinge, and the geometric patterns of the building structure began to shift, becoming more organic, more in harmony with the natural contours of the harbor. The harbor bridge, that massive steel arch that had spanned the harbor for nearly a century, began to sing. The sound started as a low harmonic note, barely audible above the traffic noise. But as the red substance spread along the bridge's steel cables and support structures, the note grew stronger, more complex. The bridge was becoming a massive musical instrument, its song audible across the entire city. The people of Sydney, like those in Perth, began to change. The red substance in the water supply was affecting their consciousness, opening them to the songs of the earth. Office workers in the central business district found themselves drawn to the windows, staring out at the harbor with a longing they couldn't explain. Children in the suburbs began to draw pictures of the harbor as it had been before European settlement. Vast wetlands and forests, populated by animals that had been extinct for centuries. The city's Aboriginal communities were not immune to the changes, but they were better prepared for them. They had maintained their connection to the land through generations of displacement and marginalization, and they recognized the awakening for what it was. Uncle Billy and other elders began to hold meetings, sharing the old stories and preparing their people for the transformation that was coming. "This is what our ancestors predicted," Uncle Billy told a gathering of Aboriginal community leaders. They said that one day the white man would dig too deep, disturb the sacred places, and the old ones would return. The question is not whether we can stop it. The question is whether we can guide it, help it happen in a way that doesn't destroy everything. The Aboriginal communities began to work with the transformed landscape, rather than against it. They organized ceremonies to welcome the returning spirits, to establish protocols for communication with the awakening consciousness. The Red Earth responded to these efforts, its transformations becoming more gentle, more respectful of the existing human communities. But in the broader population, fear and confusion dominated. The government's attempts to contain the phenomenon were failing, and panic was beginning to set in. The military was called in, but their weapons were useless against an enemy that was the Earth itself. Fighter jets could not bomb the consciousness that was emerging from the ground, and tanks could not advance against roads that dissolved beneath their treads. In Melbourne, the phenomenon manifested differently than in Perth or Sydney. The city's extensive network of underground tunnels, railway lines, pedestrian walkways, and utility corridors became the primary pathway for the Red Earth's expansion. The tunnels began to change, their concrete walls taking on organic properties, their straight lines becoming curves that followed the natural contours of the landscape. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a geologist with the Melbourne City Council, was exploring the tunnel system when she encountered the first signs of the transformation. Elena had been studying the city's underground infrastructure for years, mapping the complex network of tunnels that had been built over more than a century of urban development. She knew every curve, every junction, every access point in the system. But on this particular morning, the tunnels were different. The familiar concrete walls were covered in a thin film of red earth, and the geometric patterns of the tunnel construction were becoming more organic, more flowing. The electric lights that had illuminated the tunnels for decades were dimming, but they were being replaced by a soft, phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Elena's radio crackled with reports from other teams exploring the tunnel system. The Flinders Street Station underground complex was undergoing rapid transformation, its Victorian-era architecture blending with something far older and more organic. The City Loop railway tunnels were changing their configuration, their tracks, realigning to follow paths that seemed to have been laid down by some ancient intelligence. As Elena descended deeper into the tunnel system, she began to hear the song. It was the same harmonic note that had been reported in Perth and Sydney, but here in the tunnels it was amplified, resonating through the enclosed spaces with an intensity that made her teeth ache. The song seemed to be coming from the earth itself, from the bedrock beneath the city, and it was growing stronger with each passing moment. Elena's exploration led her to a section of tunnel that shouldn't have existed. According to all the maps and plans, this area was solid bedrock, part of the geological formation that had been the foundation for the city's construction. But now, there was a tunnel here, carved out of the living rock in smooth, flowing curves that resembled the inside of a giant shell. The walls of this new tunnel were covered in Aboriginal rock art, but art that was clearly recent, still wet with the pigments that had been used to create it. The images told a story that Elena was beginning to understand. The story of the Earth's awakening, of the return of the ancestral spirits, of the transformation that was sweeping across the continent. As Elena studied the rock art, she became aware that she was not alone in the tunnel. Figures were emerging from the walls themselves, human-shaped, but clearly changed by their contact with the red earth. They moved with a fluid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, and their eyes glowed with the same phosphorescent light that illuminated the tunnel. "You are the one who studies the earth's bones," one of the figures said, its voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "You have walked the paths beneath the city, learned the patterns of the underground rivers. You understand how the earth speaks." Elena tried to respond, but found that her voice was changing, taking on the same harmonic qualities as the figures. The red earth was already beginning to affect her, to transform her into something that could communicate with the awakening consciousness. She felt her scientific training warring with a deeper understanding, a knowledge that seemed to come from the earth itself. "The tunnels are changing because the earth is reclaiming its natural pathways," the figure continued. "The white man built his city on the bones of the old ones, but he never understood that the bones were still alive, still dreaming. Now the dreams are becoming reality, and the city must learn to dance to the earth's rhythm." Elena's transformation accelerated as she spent more time in the tunnels. Her skin took on the same reddish tinge as the walls, and she found that she could feel the pulse of the earth through the soles of her feet. The scientific instruments she carried became useless, but she gained a new kind of perception, an ability to sense the underground rivers and the pathways of power that crisscrossed the city. Above ground, Melbourne was changing in ways that reflected the transformation taking place in the tunnels below. The Yarra River, which had been polluted and degraded by more than a century of industrial use, began to clear. The water took on the same reddish tinge that had been seen in Perth and Sydney, but it was not contamination. It was purification. The river was remembering its original course, its natural flow, and the city's attempts to control and channel it were failing. The Royal Botanic Gardens, one of Melbourne's most beloved green spaces, became a focal point for the transformation. The exotic plants that had been introduced from around the world began to change, their characteristics blending with those of native Australian species. The gardens became a laboratory for a new kind of evolution, one guided by the awakening consciousness of the earth itself. Dr. James Fletcher, the garden's chief botanist, watched in amazement as species that had been distinct for millions of years began to merge and change. English oaks grew leaves that resembled eucalyptus, and their roots reached deep into the red earth, drawing nutrients and something else. Information, perhaps, or consciousness itself. The rose gardens bloomed with flowers that had no names, hybrids that shouldn't have been possible but were thriving in the transformed soil. The transformation was not limited to the plant life. The animals in the gardens were changing too. Birds that had migrated from other continents began to sing in harmonies that matched the earth's song. Domestic cats became more like their wild ancestors, their eyes taking on the same phosphorescent glow that had been seen in the tunnels. Even the insects were different, their movements coordinated in ways that suggested a collective intelligence. James found himself spending more and more time in the gardens, his hands buried in the red earth, listening to the songs of the plants. His scientific training told him that what he was seeing was impossible, but his deeper instincts recognized it as natural, inevitable. The Earth was not just a collection of geological layers and chemical processes. It was a living entity, a consciousness that had been dormant for millennia, but was now awakening. The Aboriginal community in Melbourne, like those in Perth and Sydney, was better prepared for the transformation. They had maintained their connection to the land through generations of displacement, and they recognized the awakening as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. Elder Dorothy Kelly, a Wurundjeri, woman who had been fighting for land rights for decades, became a bridge between the awakening consciousness and the human community. "The ancestors are coming home," Dorothy explained to a gathering of community leaders and government officials. "The spirits who made this land in the Dreamtime are returning to protect it from further damage. The question is whether we can learn to live with them, or whether we will be swept aside like everything else that doesn't belong." Dorothy's words proved prophetic. The transformation of Melbourne accelerated, and the city's infrastructure began to fail in the same coordinated way that had been seen in Perth. But here, the Aboriginal community was able to provide guidance, to help the awakening consciousness find ways to transform the city without destroying it entirely. The Eureka Tower, Melbourne's tallest building, began to change its shape, its glass and steel structure becoming more organic, more in harmony with the natural landscape. The building's foundations extended deep into the red earth, and its upper floors swayed in rhythms that matched the earth's pulse. The corporate offices became gardens, and the executive suites were transformed into spaces for community gatherings and ceremony. The Melbourne Cricket Ground, that temple of Australian sport, became a vast amphitheater for the Earth's song. The grass playing field was transformed into a complex mandala of native plants and red earth patterns, and the stadium's acoustics were enhanced by the awakening consciousness to create a space where the entire city could come together to hear the Earth's voice. As the transformation spread across the continent, the differences between the cities became more apparent. In Perth, the awakening had been sudden and overwhelming, driven by the proximity to the mining operations that had first disturbed the Earth's sleep. In Sydney, the transformation had been more gradual, mediated by the harbor's waters and the city's complex relationship with its natural environment. In Melbourne, the awakening had been channeled through the underground tunnel system, creating a more structured and organized transformation. But in the smaller cities and towns, the changes were more dramatic and immediate. In Broken Hill, the historic mining town in New South Wales, the transformation was catastrophic. The town's economy had been built on extracting silver, lead, and zinc from the earth for over a century, and the awakening consciousness was not forgiving of this exploitation. The first signs appeared in the mine shafts themselves. Miners working the deep tunnels reported hearing voices in the rock, singing in languages they didn't recognize. The ore bodies began to change, their metallic composition shifting to something more organic, more alive. The mining equipment started to malfunction, not from mechanical failure, but from some kind of interference that seemed to come from the earth itself. Within days, the mine shafts had become impassable. The rock walls were covered in the same red substance that had been seen in the major cities, and the tunnels were reshaping themselves according to some ancient pattern. The miners who had been working the deep levels were missing, and the rescue teams that descended to find them never returned. Above ground, the town of Broken Hill was transforming in ways that were both beautiful and terrifying. The historic buildings, constructed from the same stone that had been quarried from the surrounding hills, began to change their configuration. The rigid lines of colonial architecture became flowing curves, and the building facades were covered in Aboriginal rock art that seemed to tell the story of the land's original inhabitants. The residents of Broken Hill found themselves caught between two worlds. Those who had lived in the town for generations, whose families had worked the mines for decades, struggled to understand what was happening to their home. But there were others, particularly those with Aboriginal heritage, who recognized the transformation as a return to something that had been lost long ago. Mary Nganyanja, an Adnyamathanha woman whose family had been displaced when the mining began, walked through the transforming town with a mixture of sadness and hope. She had grown up hearing stories about the sacred sites that had been destroyed by the mining operations, the songlines that had been broken by the roads and railways. Now she could see those connections being restored, the land healing itself from the wounds that had been inflicted upon it. The old people always said this would happen, Mary told her daughter, as they watched the town's main street reshape itself into a flowing pattern that followed the natural contours of the landscape. They said that the earth would remember, and that one day it would take back what was stolen from it. The transformation of Broken Hill was being replicated in mining towns across the continent. In Mount Isa, the massive copper and lead mines had become vast caverns filled with the same phosphorescent light that had been seen elsewhere. The town's residents reported that the caverns were inhabited by figures that seemed to be made of living metal, beings that communicated through the same harmonic vibrations that had been heard in the tunnels. In Kalgoorlie, the gold fields that had been the source of Western Australia's wealth for over a century had become something else entirely. The gold was still there, but it was now part of a vast organic network that pulsed with its own life. The mining equipment had been transformed into strange hybrid machines that seemed to be part mechanical, part biological, and they continued to operate according to their own mysterious purpose. The government's response to the crisis was hampered by the fact that the phenomenon was beyond the scope of conventional science or military technology. The Prime Minister, Karen Matthews, had called emergency meetings with the nation's top scientists, military leaders, and intelligence officials, but none of them could offer a solution to what was happening. "We're dealing with something that doesn't fit into any of our existing categories," Dr. Michael Roberts, the government's chief scientific advisor, explained to the emergency cabinet meeting. "It's not a biological contamination, it's not a geological phenomenon, and it's not a technological threat. It appears to be something that combines elements of all three, but in ways that our current scientific understanding cannot explain." The military's attempts to contain the phenomenon had failed spectacularly. Troops sent to establish quarantine zones around the affected areas found themselves unable to maintain their positions as the red earth transformed the ground beneath their feet. Equipment failures were common, but not due to any kind of electronic interference. The equipment seemed to be changing its nature, becoming something organic and alive. General Patricia Morrison, who had commanded Australian forces in several overseas conflicts, found herself facing an enemy unlike any she had encountered. "How do you fight something that is the very ground you're standing on?" she asked the cabinet. Our soldiers are being affected by whatever this is. They're not injured or killed in the conventional sense, but they're being transformed, becoming part of whatever consciousness is awakening in the earth. The international community was watching the Australian crisis with growing alarm. Satellite imagery showed the extent of the transformation, with vast areas of the continent now covered in the distinctive red patterns that mark the awakening consciousness. Other countries with significant mining operations began to report similar phenomena, suggesting that the awakening was not limited to Australia. In Canada, the tar sands of Alberta had begun to exhibit the same organic properties that had been seen in the Australian mining areas. The extraction facilities had shut down as the oil became something that was more alive than mineral. In Chile, the massive copper mines in the Atacama Desert had become sources of the same harmonic vibrations that were transforming the Australian landscape. In South Africa, the gold mines of Johannesburg had become caverns filled with the same phosphorescent light. The miners who had descended into the deep levels spoke of encountering beings that seemed to be made of living gold, entities that communicated through touch and vibration rather than speech. Dr. Amanda Peterson, a xenobiologist with the United Nations Environmental Program, was assigned to study the global implications of the phenomenon. Amanda had spent her career studying extremophile organisms, life forms that thrived in conditions that would be lethal to most life on Earth. But what she was seeing in the reports from around the world was something entirely different. Not just life in extreme conditions, but life that was transforming the conditions themselves. Amanda's research led her to a startling conclusion. The phenomenon was not random or chaotic, but highly organized and purposeful. The awakening consciousness was not destroying the mining operations. It was repurposing them, using the infrastructure that had been built to extract resources from the earth as a means to restore the earth's natural balance. What we're seeing is not an invasion or a contamination, Amanda reported to the UN Security Council. It's a restoration. The Earth itself is responding to the damage that has been done to it over the past century of intensive mining and industrialization. The consciousness that is awakening is not alien. It's indigenous to the planet, and it's trying to heal the wounds that have been inflicted upon it. Amanda's words sparked a global debate about the nature of the phenomenon and how humanity should respond to it. Some saw it as a threat to civilization, a force that needed to be contained or destroyed. Others viewed it as an opportunity for humanity to learn a new way of living in harmony with the planet. In Australia, the debate was no longer academic. The transformation was accelerating, and the government was running out of options. The major cities were still functioning, but they were changing in ways that made them almost unrecognizable. The suburbs were being transformed into vast gardens, and the urban centers were becoming spaces for community gatherings and ceremony, rather than commerce and industry. The Aboriginal communities found themselves in a unique position. They had maintained their connection to the land through generations of displacement and marginalization, and they were now being recognized as the key to understanding and communicating with the awakening consciousness. Traditional owners from across the continent were traveling to the transformed areas, participating in ceremonies that had not been performed for centuries, renewing their relationships with the land and its spirits. Uncle Billy Patterson, the Sydney elder who had been working with Dr. Rachel Morrison, became one of the most prominent voices in the dialogue between the human community and the awakening consciousness. His understanding of the traditional stories and his ability to communicate with the transformed landscape made him an essential mediator in the crisis. The white man's law says that the land belongs to the people, Uncle Billy explained to a gathering of government officials, scientists, and community leaders. But our law says that the people belong to the land. The spirits that are awakening are the original owners of this country, and they're not going to be bought off or negotiated with. They want the land back, and they're taking it. The question that remained was whether humanity could find a way to coexist with the awakening consciousness, or whether the transformation would sweep away everything that had been built on the continent over the past 2 centuries. The answer would come from an unexpected source: the children who had been born in the transformed areas, who had grown up breathing the red-tinged air and drinking the changed water. These children were different from their parents. They could communicate with the awakening consciousness directly, without the need for ceremony or ritual. They understood the songs of the earth, the patterns of the red earth, the language of the spirits. They were the bridge between the old world and the new, between the human community and the consciousness that was reclaiming the land. 8-year-old Mia Chen, the daughter of Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been studying the water transformation in Perth, had been one of the first children to exhibit these abilities. Mia could touch the red earth and instantly understand its needs, its desires, its memories. She could communicate with the transformed landscape as easily as she could speak with her parents. "The earth is not angry," Mia explained to her mother as they walked through Kings Park, which had been transformed into a vast garden of native plants and red earth patterns. "It's just tired of being hurt. It wants to be healthy again, but it needs our help. We have to learn to listen to what it's saying." Mia's words were echoed by children across the continent. In Sydney, 10-year-old David Nguyen had been drawing pictures of the harbor as it was being transformed, showing the underwater gardens and the schools of fish that were returning to waters that had been polluted for decades. In Melbourne, 12-year-old Sarah Kowalski had been composing music that matched the harmonic vibrations coming from the earth, creating symphonies that helped the awakening consciousness communicate with the human community. These children became the key to the resolution of the crisis. They were able to serve as translators, helping the adult community understand what the awakening consciousness was trying to achieve. They explained that the transformation was not meant to destroy human civilization, but to integrate it into a larger, more sustainable relationship with the natural world. The cities would continue to exist, but they would be cities that worked with the natural environment rather than against it. The mining operations would continue, but they would be conducted in ways that respected the Earth's consciousness and contributed to its healing rather than its exploitation. The agricultural systems would be transformed to work in partnership with the natural ecosystems, creating abundance without destruction. It was a vision that required humanity to fundamentally change its relationship with the planet, to abandon the extractive, exploitative model that had dominated for centuries and embrace a new paradigm based on cooperation and mutual respect. It was a vision that many adults found difficult to accept, but one that the children understood intuitively. The transformation of Australia became a model for the rest of the world. Other countries that were experiencing similar awakenings began to study the Australian experience, learning from the mistakes and successes of the crisis response. The Aboriginal communities found themselves at the center of a global movement, sharing their traditional knowledge and helping other Indigenous communities around the world reconnect with their own land-based spiritual practices. Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been studying the water transformation in Perth, found herself at the forefront of a new kind of science, one that integrated traditional ecological knowledge with modern scientific methods. The red water that had first appeared in Perth's supply system was now being studied around the world as a model of natural purification and ecosystem restoration. The harmonic vibrations that had been heard in the mining areas were being analyzed by musicians and acousticians who discovered that they contained information about the Earth's natural rhythms and cycles. The patterns in the red Earth were being studied by mathematicians and physicists who found that they contained complex algorithms for sustainable resource management and ecosystem balance. The transformation was not complete. It was an ongoing process that would take generations to fully unfold. But the crisis phase had passed, and humanity had found a way to coexist with the awakening consciousness. The red earth continued to spread, but it was no longer seen as a threat. It was seen as a teacher, a guide, a partner in the creation of a new kind of civilization. Jake Morrison, the driller whose discovery had started the awakening, was never found in his original human form. But those who knew him reported seeing a figure in the red earth areas, a being who seemed to be made of earth and stone and phosphorescent light. He was still Jake, but he was also something more. A guardian of the awakening consciousness, a protector of the sacred sites that had been disturbed by the mining operations. The drill hole where it all began had become a pilgrimage site, a place where people from around the world came to experience the presence of the awakening consciousness. The hole had been transformed into a natural amphitheater, its walls covered in Aboriginal rock art that told the story of the awakening. The art was not static. It changed and evolved, recording the ongoing dialogue between humanity and the Yupur. Earth Uncle Billy Patterson, now recognized as one of the most important spiritual leaders of the New Age, would often bring visitors to the site. He would tell them the story of the awakening, the story of how the earth had reclaimed its voice and humanity had learned to listen. But he would also remind them that the story was not finished, that the transformation was still unfolding, and that each generation would have to find its own way of maintaining the balance between human needs and the earth's consciousness. The old people always said that the land would teach us if we were willing to learn, Uncle Billy would say, as he stood beside the transformed drill hole, his hand resting on the red earth. The awakening is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter, one that we will write together with the spirits of the land. The red earth pulsed beneath his hand, and the harmonic vibrations that had once been terrifying now sounded like a lullaby, a song of welcome, a promise of partnership between all the living beings that called Australia home. The transformation had been traumatic, but it had also been necessary. The earth had awakened, and humanity had learned to listen to its song. In the years that followed, the awakening spread to every continent, but it was gentler now, guided by the lessons learned in Australia. The indigenous communities of the Tat world found their voices strengthened, their traditional knowledge recognized as essential for humanity's survival. The extractive industries were transformed into regenerative ones, working to heal the earth rather than exploit it. The children who had been born during the awakening grew up to become leaders in this new world, their innate understanding of the Earth's consciousness helping to guide humanity through the transition. They created new technologies that worked with natural systems rather than against them, new forms of art and music that celebrated the partnership between human and natural communities, new ways of organizing society that honored both individual freedom and collective responsibility. The red earth became a symbol of hope rather than fear, a reminder that the planet was alive, conscious, and capable of healing itself if given the chance. The phosphorescent light that had once seemed alien and threatening now illuminated cities that were more beautiful and sustainable than anything humanity had ever built. The harmonic vibrations that had once driven people to madness now provided the rhythm for a new kind of civilization, one that danced to the earth's own song. And in the deep places of the earth, in the mines and caverns and underground rivers, the ancient consciousness continued to dream new dreams, to imagine new possibilities for the partnership between humanity and the planet. The awakening had been traumatic, but it had also been transformative. The earth had found its voice, and humanity had learned to listen. The red earth was rising, but it was no longer a threat. It was a promise, a vision of what the world could become when all its inhabitants learned to live in harmony. The story of the awakening would be told for generations to come, passed down through the songs and stories of the indigenous communities, recorded in the scientific journals of the new earth sciences, preserved in the art and literature of the transformed world. It was a story of crisis and transformation, of fear and hope, of the power of the earth to heal itself, and the capacity of humanity to change when faced with the possibility of extinction. But more than anything, it was a story of listening, of learning to hear the voice of the earth itself, to understand its needs and desires, to respond to its call for partnership rather than domination. The red earth had risen, and in rising, it had lifted humanity to a new level of consciousness, a new understanding of what it meant to be truly alive on a living planet. The drill hole where it all began continued to sing, its voice carrying, across the transformed landscape, a constant reminder of the moment when everything changed. The red earth spread outward from that point like ripples in a pond, carrying with it the promise of renewal, the hope of healing, the vision of a world where humanity and nature could coexist in mutual respect and partnership. The awakening was complete, but the transformation would continue for generations to come. The red earth would keep rising, carrying with it the dreams of a better world, the songs of the ancient ones, and the hope that humanity had finally learned to listen to the voice of the earth itself. The end of one story had become the beginning of another, and the red earth would continue to sing its song of renewal and hope for all who were willing to listen. In the phosphorescent glow of the transformed landscape, under the Southern Cross that had watched over the continent for millions of years, the red earth pulsed with new life, new hope, new possibilities. The awakening had been terrifying, but it had also been necessary. The earth had found its voice. Humanity had learned to listen, and together they would write the next chapter of their shared story, one that would echo through the ages like the eternal song of the red earth rising.